Hello guys, welcome back to Clinically Clear. So today let's cover all the basic aspects of demography and the most important topic, that is demographic cycle. So demography is the study of population. Okay, the study of population is demography. Simple. Now how do we basically make an equation for the population? The total population is the indigenous population, that is those who are already there in a given area. The natural increase in that population. What is the natural increase? The total number of births minus total number of deaths. That is the natural way for a population to increase. So the natural increase in the population and the net migration. Net migration is immigration minus immigration. So when immigration is people coming into that given area, immigration is people leaving the given area. So if immigration is more than immigration, of course it will increase the total population. So total population is equal to current population plus natural increase plus net migration. So what are the 5 demographic processes that can affect the population? Fertility, birth rate. Giving birth will influence the population. Marriage only ends up resulting in fertility or birth rate in a country like India. So marriage. Mortality, death rate, that will definitely decrease the population. Migration affects the population. Just now I told net migration. Social mobility. This is a bit different. This is when a person moves from one socioeconomic class to another. Same person over a long period of time from poverty goes to upper middle class. So that is social mobilities. These are the 5 basic demographic processes. Fertility or birth, mortality or death, marriage, migration and social mobility. What is population? I just now told. Now coming to the most important part that is demographic cycle or trends. The sequential changes in the total population in the demography of a country over a long period of time is given in the form of demographic cycle. Now you have 5 stages: stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, stage 5. The mnemonic is healthy. High for high stationary. Stationary, what does that indicate? Stable population. E for early expanding, increase in population. L for late expanding, increase in population. 4, L again for late stationary. So population is stable. D for declining population, so population obviously decline. But it's not that simple. So basically what happens? Initially, first few, when a country starts, okay, birth rate is very high. Let's assume that India in 1950s, okay, 1940s, 1950s, the country is born. Birth rate is very high, death rate is very high. Birth rate is high, death rate is high. What is demographic gap? Demographic gap is the difference between birth rate. Birth rate minus death rate is equal to demographic gap. Very important. Birth rate minus death rate is equal to demographic gap. So when the birth rate is high and the death rate is also high, many people are being born, many people are dying, the demographic gap is narrow because birth rate is almost equal to the death rate. So that is in stage 1, high stationary. Stage 1, what happens? High stationary. Now because birth rate and death rate both are high, the population will be stable. Of course, there no as many number of people, a high amount of births, high amount of deaths as well. So you have a stable population. That is stage 1, high stationary. Best example is rural Bangladesh, Niger. These are all very backward countries where birth rate is very high, death rate is also high. Then what happens? Stage 2, early expanding. Early expanding is when birth rate remains high. Very important. Early expanding, birth rate remains high, death rate starts decreasing. So the death rate starts increasing, birth rate remains high. So when birth rate remains the same high and death rate is decreasing, what happens to the demographic gap? Demographic gap starts increasing, and demographic gap is the maximum at the end of stage 2, because till end of stage 2 birth rate remains high and death rate has gone decreasing, and death rate has decreased a lot by end of stage 2. So this demographic gap, birth rate minus death rate, is the maximum at stage 2, that is early expanding. It starts increasing only in stage 2. Maximum is at the end of stage 2. Understood? Now another thing that's important to understand is, here the population is explosive growth. Think about it. Birth rate is still very high. Death rate is going on decreasing. It has started to decrease. So this is why it is known as demographic trap. It is bad for a country having a population explosion, sudden increase in population. The country won't be able to meet the demands of that population, right? This is a demographic trap. It is bad for the country. This is explosive population. Okay. Next, coming to late expanding. Now, late expanding, birth rate also starts decreasing. Death rate has continued to decline. Death rate is still in slow decline. Now, birth rate starts decreasing. But the decrease in birth rate is not as much as the decrease in death rate. That is basically, birth rate is still more than death rate. Okay. Birth rate is still more than death rate. But birth rate is also decreasing. So birth rate is still more than death rate, but because birth rate is decreasing, the demographic gap starts decreasing. This demographic gap starts decreasing. So when does the demographic gap start decreasing? Stage 3, important, late expanding. And the population here is still increasing. See, people miss, demographic gap is decreasing. That is, birth rate minus death rate, the difference is decreasing. Why? Because now birth rate is also decreasing, death rate is also decreasing, but before birth rate was high, but now birth rate has decreased. So the demographic gap starts decreasing. But then population is still increasing. Why? Because birth rate is still more than death rate. Yes, see, here let's assume here the birth rate was 10. Let's assume here the birth rate was 10, death rate was 10. Here birth rate remained 10, death rate became 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, and then suddenly here birth rate become 8, 6. So this gap, it goes on reducing. So demographic gap also starts decreasing in phase 3. But population is still increasing. But the rate of population growth, that is birth rate is still more than death rate. But because demographic gap is lesser, the rate of population growth is much lesser than 2. Okay. Now stage 2 and 3, that is early expanding, late expanding. Both are seen in developing countries. India is currently in late expanding, that is stage 3. Next, coming to stage 4, late stationary. Here death rate is also on slow decline, birth rate is also on slow decline, and birth rate is pretty much equal to death rate. Understood? So if both have declined, birth rate has declined, death rate has declined, but both of them are pretty much equal. So what has happened to the demographic gap? It has once again become narrow, just like phase 1. See, in stage 1, birth rate was high, death rate was high, but they were pretty much the same. So narrow demographic gap. Here, birth rate is slowly in decline, death rate is slowly in decline, but they are almost equal to each other. So narrow demographic gap. Understood? And here the population is stable. This is an ideal stage, stage 4. USA, Canada, UK, all these developed countries are in stage 4, that is late stationary. This is the best. Eventually, what can happen is it can go into a stage 5. Stage 5 declining population, death rate eventually stabilizes. See, once death rate will never decrease. How will death rate keep on increasing? You only have so many number of people, right? Death rate will never keep on decreasing, but birth rate still remains on slow decline. In stage 5, that is declining population, birth rate is still on slow decline, but death rate very slow decline or eventually stabilizes, and by the end of stage 5, birth rate becomes less than death rate. More people are dying than being born. So demographic gap, birth rate minus death rate, becomes the least. It becomes negative as death rate becomes more than birth rate. Understood? This is seen in declining populations like Japan, Italy, Norway, etc. Understood? So stage 1, high birth rate, high death rate. Demographic gap, narrow. High stationary. Stage 2, early expanding. Birth rate remains high, death rate starts decreasing. So demographic gap starts increasing, and the end of stage 2 demographic gap is the maximum explosive demographic trap, explosive population growth. Stage 3, late expanding. Birth rate has started decreasing, death rate is continues on slow decline, but birth rate still more than death rate. Population is still increasing, but not explosively. Demographic gap starts decreasing. Demographic gap starts decreasing. Stage 4, late stationary, best stage, stable population. Birth rate is on slow decline, death rate is on slow decline, and demographic gap is very narrow. Declining population, demographic gap is negative because death rate becomes more than birth rate, because death rate eventually stabilizes and birth rate keeps on falling. Okay. Now, before we come to the age pyramids of the 5 phases, we'll first understand what are age pyramids. Okay. The graphical representation of age, sex, and population in the form of a double histogram graph is age pyramid. So we get to know three things from an age pyramid. The y-axis represents the age. So because the y-axis represents the age, the height tells you the life expectancy of a country. So height tells you the life expectancy. The width tells you the population. So through the populations, we can get to know the shape of the age pyramid. So the shape of the age pyramid tells you the demographic trend, tells you the stage of the demographic cycle, which I'll come to just now. And the symmetry, one side is for males, one side is for females. So if we're clearly seeing that both of them are symmetricals, sex ratio is normal. So symmetry tells you the sex ratio. So you get three inferences from age pyramids. Okay. Now, as I told you, age pyramids, y-axis is for age. So as we go up, age gets higher and higher. So initially you have the pre-reproductive phase, then you have the reproductive phase, and the post-reproductive population. So this is how you can see it in a age pyramid. Now you mainly have two types. Okay. You have a broad base pyramids or a broad belly pyramid. This is the broad classification. Okay. Broad base pyramids is where you have more of pre-reproductive phase and reproductive phase and very less of post-reproductive phase. This is seen in developing countries where the growth rate is very high. Okay. This is seen in developing countries with a growing population. Broad belly pyramids where the reproductive population is fat, pre-reproductive is also fat but not that much, and post-reproductive also is not very low. So basically the belly is also much fatter. This is seen in stable population, that is developed countries. Okay, this is the broad classification, but this is not always true. I'll tell you what I mean. Basically, see, stage 1. Okay, see, as I told you, this is pre-reproductive, this is reproductive, this is post-reproductive. Stage 1, high stationary. What did I tell? High birth rate, high death rate. So high death rate meaning very few people are making it to old age. That's why you can see that very few people in old age, but very lot number of people in young age, pre-reproductive phase. That is why it gives you a pyramidal shape. Okay, growing population. Pyramidal shape. That is an expansive pyramid. Then it becomes losing pyramid. Why? Because stage 2, early expanding, birth rate is still high and death rate has now started decreasing. So you'll have more of reproductive, post-reproductive, more old people. So pyramidal becomes losing pyramidal in stage 2. Both these pyramidal age pyramids are known as triangular age pyramids or expansive age pyramids. Important. Understood? Then what happens in stage 3? Stage 3, that is late expanding. Birth rate also started decreasing. So now birth rate also started decreasing. Death rate is still on decline. So you'll still have a lot of post-reproductive, reproductive, post-reproductive, reproductive, reproductive, post-reproductive. You'll have a lot of people. And the birth rate has begun to decline. So this is the globular age pyramid. So globular age pyramid, stage 3, that is late expanding. Stage 4 is bell-shaped or cylindrical. Bell-shaped or cylindrical, what do you have? Also known as stationary pyramids. Why? Because these are seen in late stationary stage, that is a stable population where you have pre-reproductive, reproductive and post-reproductive, all three almost same. Obviously you'll have less of post-reproductive age group because as people get older, they tend to die. But you can have that bell-shaped distribution, that is ideal stationary pyramids. Then last is a declining population where death rate is higher than birth rate. Okay. Yeah, where birth rate is very low. So you have very, very less pre-reproductive population, very less children. And you have more of old age, reproductive, old age, senile group. So this is seen in declining population, stage 5, also known as constrictive pyramids, also known as urn-shaped pyramids or losing cylindrical pyramids. So stage 1, pyramidal, stage 2, losing pyramidal, stage 3, globular, stage 4, best one, that is bell-shaped, urn-shaped, cylindrical, stage 5, constrictive or constrictive or urn-shaped or losing cylindrical, and the pyramidal ones are also known as triangular or expansive age pyramids. So this is about the age pyramids, how we can get to know the demographic trend through the shape of the age pyramids. So shape tells you the demographic cycle, height tells you the life expectancy, and symmetry tells you the sex ratio. Next, coming to demographic gift or demographic dividend or demographic bonus, which is a good thing, and you have demographic liability, which is a bad thing. See, being in stage 3 is actually a good thing, because here population has a lot of economically productive population, that is the youth, those from 15 to 20, 30. You have a lot of economically productive population in stage 3, that is late expansive phase. What is the reason? Because here death rate has decreased, of course. Death rate has decreased, but birth rate is also decreasing, but it's still more than death rate. So you still have an increasing population, but birth rate is still more, birth rate is still decreasing, but birth rate is still more than death rate. So you'll still have a lot of youth, you'll still have a lot of economic productive population. This is known as demographic gift or demographic dividend or demographic bonus. Whereas demographic liability is stage 5. Stage 5, declining population, very bad thing. Why is the population declining? You have a lot of elderly individuals, lot of old age, but here the birth rate is very low, very low, death rate is very low, and eventually the birth rate is less than the death rate. So when that happens, it is of course a liability. Best example is China. China, when they implemented their one child norm, birth rate severely decreased. Death rate also severely decreased because of excellent healthcare. So now you have a lot of elderly individuals, no youth, because death rate is actually more than the birth rate. So it is demographic liability stage 5 due to fall in both birth rate and death rate. Demographic gift stage 3. Best example is India. Here birth rate is falling but still more than death rate. So you'll have a lot of economically productive population. So why do we need this economically productive population? Is because of something known as dependency ratio. Dependency ratio is the total dependent population divided by the total independent population into 100. So dependent population can be young age dependency, that is which is the independent population, those that are economically productive, between 15 to 64-year-olds. Young age dependents are between 0 to 14-year-old kids. They're dependent on the independents. Old age, more than 65-year-olds, they are also dependent. So young age dependency, old age dependency, you can split total dependency ratio into the two of them. Into 100 you'll get percentage. In India, the total dependency is 48%, but it is seen that 38% is young age dependency and only 10% is old age dependency. That tells you that India has a very young population. Then coming to population explosion. So this is an important topic because it has happened in India. So population explosion refers to the sudden rapid growth of the country's population to an extent where the natural resources cannot meet basic needs. In India, we have so much population explosion, so much poverty. These poor people are not getting any of the resources. So that is population explosion. Okay. Which stage does it happen? Stage 2. Thankfully, we have come to stage 3 now. But in stage 2 is population explosion. Now, annual growth rate is birth rate minus death rate divided by 10. Just birth rate minus death rate, demographic gap. Just births minus deaths, natural increase. Birth rate minus death rate divided by 10 is annual growth rate. Malthusian model says if the annual growth rate is 1%, the total population will double in 70 years. So if you take it as 2%, total population will double in, okay, this is wrong, total population will double in 35 years. If you take it as 1.5%, it will double in 47 years. If you take it as 0.5%, it will double in 140 years. Common sense. Basically, you should remember that 1% is population, it doubles in 7 years, doubles in 70 years if the annual growth rate is 1% according to Malthusian model. Okay. In India, the annual growth rate is now at around 1% and the population is 1.39 billion. This is according to 2021 census. Of course, it's not true. We have way more population. We have overtaken China. Then coming to how do we classify the growth of a country? Annual growth rate less than 0.5%, slow growing. 0.5 to 1%, moderate growing. 1 to 1.5%, rapid. 1.5 to 2%, very rapid. More than 2%, population explosion. So as you can see, population explosion, it refers to the rapid growth of a population where extent where the natural resources cannot meet the basic needs. So basically, if the annual growth rate is more than 2%, is an important criteria. AGR has to be more than 2%. Only then it is known as population explosion. Okay. So this is it about demography basics. Thank you for watching. I was a bit tired, so I went a bit quick in this video. If you have any doubts, please let me know.